This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. We often think of early mammals as mere footnotes in the age of dinosaurs, but the truth is far more thrilling. Join us as we explore the hidden diversity of our ancestors, resilient pioneers that mastered the land, sea, and sky long before the giants vanished. We'll follow their journey through the asteroid's fire, the rise of brawny post-apocalyptic giants, and the eventual dawn of modern life. Prepare to discover how these tiny, scrappy survivors turned a global catastrophe into the ultimate evolutionary opportunity. Chapter 1. Hidden Diversity in the Shadow of Giants. For a very long time, the traditional story of life during the age of dinosaurs followed a predictable and somewhat lopsided script. In this version of history, the giants ruled the world with absolute authority, while our earliest mammalian ancestors were nothing more than a footnote. Tiny, timid, shrew-like creatures scurrying in the mud, barely surviving in the cracks of a world that didn't belong to them. We were taught that mammals were evolutionary laggards, waiting for a cosmic accident to clear the stage so they could finally begin their own story. But recent scientific research has begun to tear that script apart. The more we look into the fossil record of the Mesozoic era, the more we realize that mammals were not just passive observers of the dinosaurian reign. They were highly specialized, remarkably adaptable, and surprisingly diverse pioneers that had already mastered a wide range of ecological roles long before the first asteroid ever loomed in the sky. The shrew-like stereotype often applied to these early creatures actually has a specific biological basis in Morganucodon, a 205-million-year-old mammal found in Wales and China. While Morganucodon was indeed small and insectivorous, it was far from a primitive failure. It was a sophisticated animal that already possessed many of the hallmarks of our lineage. However, even Morganucodon was not the beginning. The discovery of Brazilodon, a shrew-like animal from South America, has pushed the origins of the mammalian lineage back to approximately 225 million years ago. Brazilodon provides the first evidence of diffeodonty, the possession of milk teeth followed by a single set of adult teeth. This specialized dental replacement is a key mammalian trait, suggesting that the fundamental biological machinery of our kind was already in place while the very first dinosaurs were just beginning to appear. These early ancestors were also developing the unique anatomical toolkit that defines us today. One of the most significant evolutionary leaps involved the transformation of the jaw. In our reptilian ancestors, the jaw was composed of several bones, but over millions of years, some of these bones migrated to the head to become the three bones of the middle ear, the malleus, incus, and stapes. This transition allowed mammals to hear high-frequency sounds that their reptilian contemporaries likely could not perceive. Furthermore, the discovery of Microdocodon gracilis, a tiny Jurassic mammal from China, revealed the presence of a sophisticated hyoid bone. This structure is essential for the complex throat movements required for suckling, proving that the ability to nurse young, a defining characteristic of mammals, had evolved by the Middle Jurassic. To understand just how specialized these early mammals became, we have to look toward one of the most unlikely places for a thriving prehistoric ecosystem, the ancient Arctic. Today, northern Alaska is often pictured as a frozen, desolate emptiness. But 73 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous, it was a world of vast, stretching forests. While it was situated at a high latitude, the climate was remarkably different, with temperatures comparable to modern-day Miami. Despite the warmth, it still presented one of the most grueling challenges on the planet, the polar night. For several months of the year, the region was plunged into total darkness. Temperatures dropped, food became scarce, and the sun simply vanished. Yet, research into the Prince Creek Formation has revealed that mammals didn't just endure these conditions, they flourished. Among the most significant finds in this region are the fossilized remains of 3 previously unknown mammal species that lived alongside the last of the great dinosaurs. These creatures were part of a group known as multituberculates, a lineage of rodent-like mammals that are often called the lost tribe of our family tree. They weren't directly related to modern rats or squirrels, but they filled many of the same roles. These 3 species have been given names that reflect their unique heritage and the Inuit traditions of the land where they were found. There is Comarodon borealis, or the northern curved tooth, which appears to have been a dedicated herbivore. Then there is Kyogric peregrinus, whose name translates to the little wandering hero, inspired by Inuit storytelling. This little hero was an omnivore, likely relying on a diet of both plants and insects to survive the lean winter months. Finally, we find Conisic Cosmodon polaris, the polar frost ornamented tooth, which also maintained a mixed diet but leaned more heavily toward vegetation. The discovery of these 3 distinct species living in the same area tells us something profound about Mesozoic life. They weren't just generalists eating whatever they stumbled across, they were niche specialists. By evolving to eat different foods, they avoided direct competition with one another, allowing multiple species to coexist in a harsh environment where resources were limited. This level of dietary separation is a hallmark of a mature, complex ecosystem. It shows that even under the feet of dinosaurs, mammals were busy fine-tuning their survival strategies. The success of the multituberculates as a whole is a testament to mammalian resilience. This group first appeared during the Jurassic period and lived alongside dinosaurs for over 100 million years. They survived the rise and fall of countless dinosaur lineages and even made it through the mass extinction event that eventually claimed the giants. To put their longevity in perspective, modern humans have existed for only about 300,000 years. Multituberculates reigned for more than 100 million. They were the ultimate survivors, succeeding not through sheer size or brute strength, but through a relentless ability to adjust to their environment. The story of Mesozoic mammalian diversity extends far beyond the Arctic Circle. If we travel back to the Middle and Late Jurassic, we find that mammals were already exploring lifestyles that we once thought were reserved for the modern era. In northeastern China, researchers discovered the remains of a creature called Castorocata lutricimelus. Living roughly 164 million years ago, this animal looked strikingly like a modern beaver or otter. It had a flattened, scaly tail, webbed feet for swimming, and teeth specialized for catching fish. This find proved that mammals had conquered the water while dinosaurs were still at the height of their power. Around the same time, other mammals were taking to the air. Volaticotherium antiquus, whose name means ancient gliding beast, possessed a membrane of skin stretched between its limbs, much like a modern flying squirrel. It was a furry insectivore that lived in the trees, using its ability to glide to escape predators and reach new food sources. There was also Fruitifossor, a Jurassic mammal that resembled a small aardvark or anteater. It had powerful shovel-like limbs designed for digging into the mounds of social insects. These animals demonstrate that the mammalian body plan was incredibly plastic, capable of adapting to burrowing, swimming, climbing, and gliding millions of years before the dinosaurs vanished. One of the most persistent myths about this era is that mammals were always the prey and never the predators. While it's true that many were small, some were bold enough to turn the tables. Repenomamus robustus, a mammal about the size of a large badger or a small coyote, provided direct evidence of this. A fossilized specimen was found with the remains of a juvenile dinosaur, Upsidicosaurus, preserved in its stomach. Whether it was an active hunter or a scavenger, it's clear that some Mesozoic mammals were large and powerful enough to incorporate dinosaurs into their diet. This leads us to a crucial question. If mammals were so adaptable and capable, why did they stay relatively small for so long? For decades, the answer seemed obvious. Dinosaurs were simply too big and too dominant to allow mammals to grow. However, recent research into mammalian jaw structures and functional diversity suggests a more nuanced reality. It wasn't just the dinosaurs keeping our ancestors small, it was also other mammals. During the Mesozoic, the world was filled with these highly specialized, archaic mammal groups like the multituberculates. These groups had already claimed the roles of the specialized gliders, swimmers, and diggers. The ancestors of today's modern mammals, the placentals and marsupials, were often the scrappy generalists, kept in the ecological shadows not just by the thundering reptiles, but by their own more established mammalian cousins. One of the earliest known members of this modern lineage was Jeremiah, the Jurassic mother, a 160-million-year-old creature that represents the earliest known therian, the common ancestor of all modern placentals and marsupials. This competitive landscape forced many early mammals into a nocturnal lifestyle. For more than 100 million years, while dinosaurs dominated the daylight hours, mammals mastered the dark. This period, often called the nocturnal bottleneck, left a permanent mark on our biology. To survive the night, mammals evolved a heightened sense of hearing, a sophisticated sense of smell, and the ability to maintain a constant body temperature. Our ancestors traded away the sharp color vision of reptiles for the ability to navigate a world where the sun never shone. Fur became a necessity for warmth, and the complex structure of the mammalian ear began to take shape. However, even this rule had its exceptions. Ventana certici, a 20-pound mammal from the late Cretaceous of Madagascar, challenges the idea that all Mesozoic mammals were small and visually impaired. Ventana possessed massive eyes, suggesting it had keen vision that defied the nocturnal bottleneck. Yet, in a strange evolutionary trade-off, its ears were underdeveloped compared to its contemporaries. This creature serves as a reminder that the mammalian story is one of constant experimentation, where different lineages found wildly different ways to solve the problems of survival. Even as they lived these secretive lives, mammals were moving across the globe in ways that reshaped the planet's biodiversity. We now know that land bridges between Asia and North America were active much earlier than previously thought. The little wandering hero, Kayakruk peregrinus, had close relatives in what is now Mongolia. This suggests that as far back as 92 million years ago, small mammals were embarking on epic intercontinental journeys, crossing through the Arctic corridor to find new homes. The Arctic wasn't just a place to survive, it was a vital bridge that allowed life to flow between hemispheres. The connection between these distant lands was famously explored during the Polish-Mongolian paleontological expeditions of 1963 to 1971. Led by the pioneering scientist Zofia Kielin-Jaworowska, these expeditions into the Gobi Desert uncovered a treasure trove of multituberculate fossils. Her work revealed that these mammals were not just minor players, but were incredibly diverse and successful across the northern hemisphere. The similarities between the Mongolian fossils and those found in the American Arctic confirmed that mammals were the great migrators of the Cretaceous, moving across vast distances while the continents were still shifting. As the Cretaceous period drew toward its close, the world was a crowded, competitive place. Mammals were everywhere, in the trees, under the ground, in the rivers, and even in the polar shadows. They had spent millions of years perfecting the art of being small and specialized. They had developed the ability to reproduce quickly, to eat almost anything, and to find shelter in the most inhospitable places. They had built a resilient foundation, unaware that the environmental stability they had adapted to was about to be shattered. The dinosaurs still held the title of the world's most prominent animals, but the specialized lives of the Mesozoic mammals had prepared them for a very different kind of future. What would happen when the sunlight that the dinosaurs relied upon finally went out? Chapter 2: The Survival Toolkit: Sheltering from the Global Furnace. 66 million years ago, the biological rules that had governed Earth for over 100 million years were not merely adjusted, they were incinerated. The giants of the land, the non-avian dinosaurs, were masters of a stable greenhouse world. Their massive bodies and specialized lifestyles perfectly tuned to the Cretaceous environment. But in a single catastrophic moment, the very traits that had ensured their dominance became their death warrants. The survival of the mammalian lineage depended on a specific toolkit, small body size, burrowing habits, and dietary flexibility that many Mesozoic lineages had carried for millions of years. When the sky turned to fire, these traits became the most valuable assets in the history of life. To understand the magnitude of the challenge, one must look at the physics of that day. An asteroid roughly 6 to 9 miles wide slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula with a force equivalent to over 1 billion nuclear bombs. The impact punched a hole in the Earth's crust 10 miles deep, but the devastation was not localized. The impact triggered a tsunami so massive it traveled at supersonic speeds, surging across the Gulf of Mexico and reaching as far inland as present-day Illinois, 2,000 kilometers from the coast. This wall of water illustrated a grim reality. For the specialists of the coastal plains, there was no escape. The immediate aftermath was a planet-scale version of a thermal pulse. As debris launched into space re-entered the atmosphere, it created a global furnace. Geologists find evidence of this in a thin layer of rock filled with billions of tiny particles called spherules. The kinetic energy of these falling spherules was staggering, equivalent to 20 million megatons of energy. It was as if a 1 megaton hydrogen bomb were detonating every 6 kilometers around the entire planet. For several hours, the surface was bathed in intense infrared radiation. Any creature standing in the open was exposed to searing heat that ignited forests thousands of miles from the impact site. This was the moment the dinosaurs were betrayed by their size. A creature the size of a triceratops had nowhere to hide. Beneath the feet of these dying giants, the first tool in the mammalian survival kit was the ability to hunker down. Because many Mesozoic mammals were small and had spent generations living in the shadows, they were already well adapted to life in burrows or near aquatic environments. This is often referred to as the sheltering hypothesis. Underground burrows acted as nature's ultimate bomb shelters. Even a few inches of soil provided incredible insulation against the extreme atmospheric temperatures. Similarly, water acted as a thermal buffer. This aquatic protection explains the survival of Lazarus taxa, lineages like the coelacanth and certain aquatic adjacent mammals that seem to vanish from the immediate fossil record only to reappear later, shielded by the heat-absorbing properties of their environment. While the Mesozoic had seen a flourish of specialized mammals, gliders, swimmers, and dedicated predators, these specialists were the first to fall. The survivors were the scrappy generalists. The very habits forced upon them by the dominance of dinosaurs became their salvation. However, surviving the first few hours was only the beginning. As the fires burned out, they were replaced by an impact winter that lasted for years. Pulverized rock, soot, and sulfuric acid blotted out the sun, halting photosynthesis. The world's forests, already ravaged by fire, collapsed, leading to a total breakdown of the food chain. This is where the second tool, dietary flexibility, became critical. Most dinosaurs were specialists, requiring vast amounts of specific vegetation or prey. Mammals, by contrast, were often unfussy eaters. In a world devoid of fresh greenery, they turned to a food web based on detritus, decaying organic matter. The survivors were the insectivores, the scavengers, and the seed eaters. Insects and aquatic plants remained relatively abundant, and seeds, designed to wait for better days, provided a concentrated source of energy for those small enough to find them. We see this toolkit in action in species like Cimolodon desoci. This mammal was roughly the size of a golden hamster and represented the kind of lineage ancestral to the eventual survivors. It was an omnivore with teeth designed to handle a variety of foods, from fruits to insects. This lack of specialization meant that when the environment shifted radically, Similodon and its relatives did not have to change their behavior. They simply had to keep doing what they were already good at. Similarly, the newly described Militocodon lidi, a mammal about the size of a chinchilla, appears in the record just after the extinction. Weighing only about 300 grams and subsisting on a mix of plants and insects, its survival was a testament to the power of being a small-bodied generalist in a world of ruins. The extinction was nonetheless a devastating bottleneck. In western North America, it is estimated that up to 93% of mammal species were wiped out. The metatherians, ancestors of today's marsupials, nearly vanished. The survivors were those that could reproduce quickly, the third vital tool in the kit. While a large dinosaur might take 20 years to reach sexual maturity, a small mammal could reach maturity in months. In a post-apocalyptic landscape where every day was a struggle, the ability to rapidly replenish population numbers was the difference between a temporary decline and total extinction. As the soot eventually washed out of the atmosphere, the sun returned to a battered planet. The first signs of recovery are found in the fossil record as a firm spike, a layer of rock exceptionally rich in fern fossils. Ferns are nature's first responders, the first to colonize areas devastated by fire. For thousands of years, the Earth was a fern world, a low-diversity ecosystem where these hardy plants were the only things thriving. Scuttling through these fern-choked forests were the few lineages that had made it through. One such survivor was Purgatorius, a creature that looked like a cross between a shrew and a tiny squirrel. It was small, likely nocturnal, and an omnivore that fed on insects and whatever fruit it could find. It endured the worst day in Earth's history because it was a generalist living in a world purged of its specialists. Along with other hardy lineages, it began the slow process of reclaiming a landscape that was beginning its slow reorganization. These early survivors were robust, powerful diggers with chunky bones and mobile joints, traits that had allowed them to carve out safety beneath the burning surface. This physical robustness was a direct legacy of their survival strategy. The animals that survived were the ones that could dig. As the forests began to grow denser and more complex in the absence of multi-ton dinosaurs, these survivors began to fill the massive ecological vacuum. The recovery of the planet was not just a return to the status quo, it was a total reorganization. This shift raises a profound question about the timing of the mammalian rise. For a long time, it was believed that the asteroid was the sole trigger, the cosmic luck that allowed mammals to flourish. While small bodies and burrowing habits were the tools that got mammals through the apocalypse, the world they were inheriting was now wide open. The asteroid served as the final violent push for a transition that would define the future of life on Earth. Chapter 3: The Green Revolution and the Molecular Clock. While the asteroid impact is often framed as the sole architect of the modern world, a deeper look at the fossil record suggests it may have been the final act in a much longer drama. For decades, the asteroid as reset model dominated paleontology, positing that mammals only flourished because the dinosaurs were removed. However, a more nuanced debate has emerged, questioning whether the asteroid was the primary driver of mammalian success or if a quieter, greener revolution had already set the stage. This alternative perspective suggests that the rise of mammals was a delayed response to the slightly earlier radiation of angiosperms, or flowering plants, a transformation known as the Cretaceous terrestrial revolution. Long before the sky fell, the Earth's landscape was undergoing a radical shift. For hundreds of millions of years, forests were dominated by conifers and ferns, which provided a relatively uniform and nutritionally sparse environment. But during the late Cretaceous, flowering plants began an evolutionary explosion. These were not merely new decorations on the landscape, they were the engineers of a new type of ecosystem. Deciduous trees with complex canopies and thick understories replaced the open forests of the past, creating a vertical and horizontal complexity the planet had never seen. This shift provided high-energy fruits, seeds, and nectar, which in turn supported a massive radiation of insects. For a small mammal, this was a land of plenty. The traditional view suggests mammals only explored these niches once the dinosaurs vanished, but the study of mammalian jaws and teeth tells a different story. A large-scale analysis of jaw disparity, the variety of different shapes and functions within a group, reveals that mammals were already remarkably diverse during the age of dinosaurs. They had already evolved specialized forms for various diets. Surprisingly, the total variety of jaw shapes did not significantly increase in the first 10 million years after the asteroid. While mammals grew larger and more numerous, the fundamental ecological roles they would eventually fill had already been established while dinosaurs still ruled. This suggests that the ancestors of today's mammals were restricted in body size, but not in ecological creativity. They were already ruling the roost at small sizes, tracking the rise of angiosperms with precision. This is particularly evident in the multituberculates, which underwent an incredible radiation into herbivorous niches at least 20 million years before the end of the Cretaceous. Their teeth became increasingly complex, perfectly adapted for the new flowering plants. This pre-impact momentum suggests that the vegetational habitat was perhaps a more significant influence on mammalian evolution than the presence or absence of large reptiles. However, the impact did impose a temporary biological constraint on the survivors. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the surviving species were not just few in number, they were physically stunted. This disaster fauna consisted of generalists that had survived by being small enough to hunker down. While the largest mammals before the asteroid had reached the size of raccoons, those that emerged from the immediate wreckage were rarely larger than rats. The debate, then, is whether mammals were simply released from this size restriction by the removal of dinosaurs, or if they were pulled out of it by the recovery of the botanical world. The evidence for a plant-driven recovery is found in the high-resolution timeline of the Denver Basin. At sites like Coral Bluffs, we can see that the recovery of mammalian life was not a single explosion, but a series of steps tied to the appearance of specific plant groups. Once the initial fern world began to fade, the landscape transitioned into palm forests. At this 100,000-year mark, mammalian diversity doubled. By 300,000 years post-impact, the arrival of walnut species coincided with another jump in mammalian variety. The most significant turning point occurred approximately 700,000 years after the extinction, with the appearance of the first legumes. As the ancestors of the bean family spread, providing a concentrated high-protein fuel source, mammals underwent a massive growth spurt. This was a biological response to a new high-energy infrastructure. The rise of the mammals was, in many ways, fueled by the rise of the bean. This connection suggests that the age of mammals was a synergistic recovery, where the warming intervals of the Paleocene and the evolution of nutrient-rich plants provided the necessary ladder for mammals to climb out of their small-bodied past. This botanical evidence sits at the heart of a larger conflict between two scientific models, the explosive model and the trans-KP model. The explosive model, favored by many traditional fossil hunters, suggests that the major lineages of modern mammals originated and diversified almost entirely after the asteroid hit. This view is supported by the rocks, the fact that fossils of modern groups like primates and hoofed mammals are generally not found in Cretaceous strata. In contrast, the trans-KPG model is supported by the clocks. Molecular clock analysis, which uses DNA differences between living species to calculate divergence times, consistently points to a much older origin for modern mammal groups. This model suggests that the rise of placental orders was a continuous radiation that began in the late Cretaceous and was not interrupted by the mass extinction. To reconcile these views, researchers have employed birth-death shift analysis, a sophisticated statistical method that accounts for both the rate at which new species appear, birth, and the rate at which they go extinct, death. This analysis suggests that while the asteroid was a catastrophic event, it did not stop the underlying momentum of mammalian evolution. Instead, the lineages already diversifying in response to the flowering plant revolution simply continued their journey, using the dinosaur-free landscape to accelerate their growth. This transition was a period of intense experimentation and turnover. We see this in the fossil beds of Wyoming's Great Divide Basin. Just 300,000 years after the extinction, the record reveals a burst of archaic specialists that were neither purely Mesozoic nor fully modern. Among them was Bjornus honeyi, a cat-sized creature with strangely swollen teeth. These teeth were an evolutionary experiment in seed crushing, a direct response to the new botanical wealth of the Paleocene. The presence of such unique species in specific locations suggests that the post-apocalyptic world was a patchwork of evolutionary pockets where different groups were testing new survival strategies. The debate over the trigger of the mammalian rise reveals that evolution rarely has a single cause. The asteroid was the hammer that shattered the old world, but the flowering plants were the seeds of the new one. One provided the opportunity, while the other provided the means. As mammals moved from the trees to the ground, and from insect eating to herbivory, they were building a new kind of ecosystem based on high-energy interactions. This period of rapid growth led to some of the strangest creatures in our family history. As mammals bulked up to fill the roles of the departed giants, they underwent a physical transformation that was as fast as it was bizarre. Within a few million years, rat-sized survivors gave rise to massive herbivores and powerful predators that looked like nothing alive today. But as their bodies ballooned in size, a new mystery began to emerge from their fossilized skulls. Why was it that as these animals grew larger and more powerful, their most famous mammalian trait, their intelligence, seemed to be left behind? What was happening inside the brains of these post-apocalyptic pioneers as they raced to claim a world in ruins? Chapter 4. Brawn over Brains, the Post-Apocalyptic Growth Spurt. The world that emerged from the darkness of the impact winter was a landscape of unprecedented opportunity, but it was also a world of ghosts. For the few mammalian lineages that had squeezed through the bottleneck of the extinction event, the rules of life had been fundamentally reset. For over 100 million years, their ancestors had been physically capped, rarely growing larger than a badger because the ecological ceiling was held firmly in place by the dinosaurs. But with the giants gone, that ceiling had vanished. What followed was one of the most explosive and bizarre chapters in the history of life, a period where mammals began to balloon in size at a rate that seems to defy the usual pace of evolution. However, as we look closer at the skulls and skeletons of these post-apocalyptic pioneers, we find a strange paradox. While their bodies were racing to claim the Earth, their brains were being left in the dust. In the immediate wake of the asteroid, the survivors were defined by what scientists call the Lilliput effect. Named after the island of tiny people in Gulliver's Travels, this phenomenon describes a post-extinction period where surviving lineages are characterized by stunted growth. The world was a realm of rats and shrews, scuttling through a landscape of ferns and ash. The largest surviving mammals weighed barely a pound. They were the disaster fauna, the generalists who had survived by being small enough to hide and flexible enough to eat detritus. But as the climate began to warm and the forests started to recover, these tiny survivors hit an evolutionary accelerator. To visualize this transformation, we look to the fossil beds of the Denver Basin, particularly at sites like Coral Bluffs. Here, the rocks provide the physical evidence for the explosive model of mammalian evolution, the idea that the modern diversity of mammals was a direct, rapid response to the vacuum left by the dinosaurs. The timeline is staggering. Within just 100,000 years, a mere blink in geological time, mammals the size of raccoons were already appearing. By 300,000 years post-impact, some had reached the size of large beavers. In less than 1 million years, mammals had increased their body mass 100-fold. This is a rate of growth that wouldn't be seen again for another 30 million years. The definitive evidence for this get big fast strategy is found in Pantalambda, a sheep-sized creature that lived in New Mexico and Colorado. Pantalambda was robust and stocky, built with thick muscles and heavy bones. Recent research into its life history, conducted by analyzing the microscopic growth rings in its teeth and bones, has revealed a life lived in the fast lane. Pantalambda spent about 7 months in its mother's womb, a surprisingly long gestation for an animal of its size, more similar to modern mammals than the primitive, fast-breeding species of the Cretaceous. This long pregnancy meant that it was born highly developed and ready to grow. Once born, it was weaned in just over 2 months and reached its full adult size within a single year. But this rapid growth came at a cost. Most Pantalambda individuals were dead by the age of 10. They were evolutionary sprinters, pouring all their energy into reaching a massive size as quickly as possible so they could dominate the new, open landscape and reproduce before their bodies gave out. This size-first strategy was appearing everywhere. In the lush, palm-dominated forests of the early Paleocene, mammals were exploring every available niche. There were the pantodonts, like the 1,000-pound Berylambda, which resembled a giant ground sloth and was the largest mammal in its ecosystem. Even the predators were following this trend, though they weren't the sleek, intelligent hunters we think of today. A prime example is Arctocyon primavis, a carnivorous beast with powerful jaws and dagger-like teeth. Despite its fearsome appearance, Arctocyon had feet that still ended in hooved toes. It was a tiger in a llama's body, a genetic mashup that highlights the lack of specialization in this era. But as these animals were bulking up, something very strange was happening inside their heads. For a long time, scientists assumed that as mammals grew larger, their brains must have grown at the same pace. It's a logical assumption. Larger bodies generally require more complex neural wiring to manage movement and behavior. But when researchers used advanced CT scanning technology to peer inside the fossilized skulls of these Paleocene giants, they were shocked. Relative to their body size, the brains of these mammals were actually shrinking. In fact, many Paleocene mammals had brains that were proportionally smaller than those of their ancestors who lived alongside the dinosaurs. This discovery has completely upended our understanding of mammalian evolution. It turns out that for at least the first 10 million years after the extinction, mammals chose brawn over brains. They were becoming larger and more powerful, but they remained, by modern standards, remarkably dim-witted. Their olfactory bulbs, the parts of the brain responsible for smell, remained large and well-developed, which makes sense for animals that had spent millions of years as nocturnal foragers. But the neocortex, the region responsible for complex thinking, visual processing, and motor control, was tiny. They were living in a world of sense and instinct, possessing the physical power to claim the earth, but lacking the cognitive complexity we associate with mammals today. The reason for this comes down to metabolic accounting. Brains are incredibly expensive to maintain. They are energy hogs that require a constant, high-quality supply of calories and oxygen. In the modern world, a human brain uses about 20% of the body's total energy. In the immediate aftermath of a global apocalypse, energy was the most precious resource of all. The survivors were those who could make the most of limited food and harsh conditions. In this high-stakes environment, mammals faced a trade-off. They could invest their energy into building a bigger, smarter brain, or they could invest it into building a bigger, stronger body. For the first 10 million years, the body won. Being big offered immediate, tangible advantages. It made them harder to eat, allowed them to travel further for food, and let them process tougher, lower-quality vegetation. In a world where the giant dinosaurian competitors were gone, the priority was simply to fill the empty space. There was very little competition from other smart animals, so there was no evolutionary pressure to be intelligent. You didn't have to be the smartest creature in the forest, you just had to be the biggest. This period of brawny dominance lasted throughout the Paleocene, but it couldn't last forever. As the world became more crowded and the vacant ecological niches began to fill up, the nature of survival began to change. The easy free-for-all of the early post-apocalyptic world was giving way to a more competitive landscape. Mammals were no longer just competing with the ghost of the dinosaurs, they were competing with each other. This is when we see the metabolic calculations start to shift. Around 10 million years after the asteroid impact, at the dawn of the Eocene epoch, the fossil record shows a dramatic change. Suddenly, the brain sizes of various mammalian lineages began to increase independently and concurrently. As competition for resources intensified, being big was no longer enough. Animals needed new skills to survive. They needed better vision to navigate the dense, complex canopies of the maturing forests. They needed better motor control to snag hard-to-reach fruits or to outmaneuver a predator. They needed better memory to track the seasonal availability of food. We can see this shift clearly when we compare the Paleocene giants to their Eocene successors. While the brawny Arctochion dominated the Paleocene, the Eocene saw the rise of animals like Hieracius modestus. An ancestor of modern rhinos and tapirs, Hieracius was the brainy counterpart to the archaic giants that preceded it. It possessed a significantly larger brain relative to its body size, signaling a move toward the cognitive complexity that would eventually define modern mammalian orders. The goofy and weird experiments of the Paleocene were being replaced by more specialized, efficient, and intelligent lineages. The story of the post-apocalyptic growth spurt is a reminder that evolution is not a straight line toward progress or intelligence. It is a reactive process, driven by the immediate needs of the environment. For 10 million years, our ancestors proved that in a world in ruins, intelligence is a luxury and brawn is a necessity. They built the physical foundation of the age of mammals, ballooning in size and diversifying their diets while their brains waited for the right moment to catch up. They were the disaster fauna that became giants, filling a silent world with the sound of thundering hooves and powerful jaws. But as these brawny pioneers were reaching their physical peak, another group of survivors was quietly watching from the sidelines. The multituberculates were still there, having navigated the first few million years of the Paleocene with the same scrappy resilience they had shown for 100 million years. They had seen the rise and fall of the giants before, and they had successfully adapted to the new world. But as the ancestors of modern mammals began to develop their new high-powered brains and specialized bodies, these long-lived survivors were about to face a challenge that no amount of resilience could overcome. The world was becoming a place where being a generalist was no longer enough. What was it about the rise of modern lineages that finally spelled doom for a group that had outlasted the dinosaurs? Chapter 5: The Lost Tribe and the Modern Dawn. As the Cenozoic era progressed, the world began to settle into a shape we might recognize, yet this transition was defined by a quiet biological tragedy. For over 130 million years, one group of mammals had stood as the ultimate testament to resilience. These were the multituberculates, the rodent-like pioneers that had navigated the long shadows of the Jurassic, witnessed the breakup of supercontinents, and survived the fires of the asteroid apocalypse. They were the lost tribe of mammals, a lineage so successful that they outlasted almost every other vertebrate group of their time. Yet they hold a somber distinction in the history of life. They are the only major branch of the mammalian family tree to go completely extinct without leaving a single living descendant. Their story did not end in a slow fade, but in a dramatic clash with a new world that no longer had a place for them. To understand the magnitude of their fall, we must first recognize the height of their success. In the millions of years following the extinction of the dinosaurs, the multituberculates were not merely surviving, they were poised to become the new masters of the earth. While they had spent the Mesozoic as small, secretive creatures, the Paleocene offered them the chance to dream big. During this era, some lineages, specifically the Taeniolabidoidea, reached weights exceeding 100 kilograms, or roughly 220 pounds. These were not the tiny scurriers of the Cretaceous. They were the size of large bears or giant beavers, becoming the first mammalian giants to claim the vacant herbivorous niches left behind by the dinosaurs. For a time, it seemed the future belonged to them. Even the beaver-sized Kimbetosaurus, with its specialized shearing teeth, was just one example of a group that was rapidly diversifying to exploit the new lush forests of the post-impact world. However, the environment was shifting in ways that favored a different kind of survivor. As the Paleocene gave way to the Eocene, the Earth experienced a period of intense global warming known as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. Temperatures spiked, and the planet was blanketed in dense subtropical jungles. This climatic shift acted as a filter, favoring animals that could navigate a more complex, high-energy world. The brawny pioneers of the early Paleocene, who had prioritized body size and physical robustness over cognitive complexity, began to face a new kind of pressure. The vacuum was filling up, and the era of the generalist was coming to an end. This was the moment the modern orders of mammals began to emerge, appearing in the fossil record with startling suddenness. These were the ancestors of the animals we know today, the first true primates, the earliest hoofed mammals, and the pioneers of the air and sea. In the dense Eocene forests, we find the remains of Hyracotherium, the dawn horse, a tiny multi-toed creature that was already developing the specialized limbs for efficient movement. In the rivers and coastal shallows, the first ancestors of whales, such as the four-legged Pachycetus, were beginning their transition back to the water. In the skies, the first bats, like Onychonicterus, were mastering powered flight. These modern lineages possessed a critical advantage that the multituberculates lacked: specialization. Their limbs were becoming finely tuned for specific modes of locomotion, running, swimming, or climbing, and their brains were beginning to grow in complexity to manage these new demanding behaviors. While the multituberculates had relied on a body plan that had worked for 130 million years, the newcomers were reinventing what it meant to be a mammal. They were faster, more agile, and increasingly more intelligent. The most direct and devastating threat to the multituberculates, however, came from a group that beat them at their own game: the true rodents. Appearing around 57 million years ago, rodents were evolutionary dynamos that occupied the exact ecological niches the multituberculates had held for eons. On the surface, the two groups looked similar, but under the hood, the rodents were a modernized, high-performance version of the same strategy. The primary mechanical advantage of the rodent lay in its jaw. While multituberculates had complex, multi-cusped teeth designed for a shearing, grinding motion, rodents developed a more efficient gnawing mechanism. Their incisors were ever-growing, self-sharpening tools powered by a specialized arrangement of the masseter muscles that allowed for a powerful forward and back grinding motion. This mechanical efficiency allowed rodents to process a wider variety of tough seeds and vegetation more quickly than their multi-rivals. Beyond their physical tools, rodents possessed a superior reproductive strategy. They developed a faster reproductive cycle, with shorter gestation periods and the ability to produce larger litters more frequently. In the high-stakes competition of the Eocene, the ability to out-reproduce a competitor is often more important than the ability to outfight them. The rodents were simply faster at replacing themselves and adapting to local environmental changes. As the forests became more competitive and resources more contested, the multituberculates were slowly but surely squeezed out. The tragedy of the multituberculates is that they did not fail because of a lack of resilience. They were the ultimate survivors, having endured 100 million years of dinosaurian dominance and a global apocalypse. They failed because the biological rules of the world had changed. The generalist strategies that had served them through the Mesozoic were no longer enough to compete with the specialized efficiency of the Eocene newcomers. By about 35 million years ago, the last of the multituberculates vanished from the fossil record. A lineage that had existed for 130 million years, nearly 400 times longer than our own species has walked the Earth, simply ceased to be. Their disappearance marked the final end of the Mesozoic way of life. When the last multituberculate died, the final link to the world of the dinosaurs was severed. The Earth was now fully the domain of the modern orders, a world of specialized runners, intelligent social groups, and high-energy predators. The lost tribe left behind no heirs, only their fossilized teeth, those complex corn kernel-shaped molars that tell the story of a group that almost inherited the Earth. As we look back at this transition, we are forced to recognize that the rise of our own lineage was not an inevitable march toward progress. It was a chaotic, competitive struggle, where the winners were often decided by a slight mechanical advantage in a jawbone or a few days' difference in a gestation period. The story of the multituberculates serves as a humbling reminder of the nature of success in deep time. If a group as durable and adaptable as the multis could be undone by the arrival of a more efficient competitor, it raises a profound question about the stability of our own modern ecosystems. In a world that is once again undergoing rapid environmental change, are we seeing the beginning of a new reorganization, where the specialized giants of today will eventually give way to a new generation of scrappy, unexpected survivors waiting in the shadows? The history of mammals is not a simple tale of luck, but a saga of ancient resilience. From the specialized pioneers of the Mesozoic to the brawny giants of the Paleocene, our ancestors survived by mastering the shadows and adapting to a world in ruins. We have seen how the lost tribe of multituberculates endured for eons, only to be eclipsed by the specialized efficiency of the modern orders we know today. This journey reminds us that evolutionary success is never permanent. It is a fragile balance between biological innovation and environmental opportunity. As our planet enters a new era of rapid change, we are left to wonder, which of today's overlooked generalists are already preparing to step into the light? Thank you for listening to the incredible story of the tiny survivors that became the masters of the Earth.